They called me Bavel from the first morning. I learned what the word meant on the third day, from a Velthric quartermaster named Osirel who had the particular gift of speaking bluntly in a second language. She was handing me my ration kit, a dense block of compressed nutrients that tasted like wet chalk and smelled faintly of copper, and she said it the way you might describe the weather. Matter of fact, informational. Bavel is the small one who does not yet know, the youngling who has not grown the knowing skin. She tapped the smooth shell of her own thorax just below the collar of her uniform. We grow it here in the hard casing. Humans do not grow it, so, Bavel. I took the ration block, thanks for that. Is not insult, she said. Is category. Sure it is, I said and walked to my table. The knowing skin was what the Velthric called their navigation sense, a dense array of magnetoreceptive tissue that grew into the inner surface of their carapace during the larval stage and spent the next 20 years calibrating itself to every planet they walked on. By the time a Velthric adult reached the age of deep terrain service, they could feel a magnetic anomaly the way I feel a splinter. Specific, immediate, located to within centimeters. They could read seismic tremor through the soles of their feet. They could orient by atmospheric pressure gradient the way I orient by signage. The precision was extraordinary. The depth of the sense was extraordinary. The biological investment it represented in Velthric developmental physiology was apparently on the order of what humans invest in binocular vision and fine motor control combined. The Veth-Kalavar Academy for Deep Terrain Navigation existed to train beings with knowing skin to use it well. The curriculum assumed the knowing skin. Every exercise, every test, every lecture hall diagram and simulation table was built around it. I did not have knowing skin, I was human. I was also the only human enrolled in the 62nd class cohort of Veth-Kalavar Academy, and the first human to attend in 11 years, and the circumstances by which I came to be there involved a staffing shortfall at a small extraction company, 3 sheets of missing paperwork, and a bureaucratic assignment algorithm that did not include species-appropriate enrollment as a variable. The reason I was there at all was paperwork, which is the reason most things in my life have happened. I had submitted an application to the Interspecies Survey Cooperative 3 years earlier, when I was 22, looking for field certification in deep planetary geology. I had spent the previous 4 years working survey contracts in the Ithran Chain, a scatter of volcanic islands in the northern sea of a colony world called Osmurin, for a small extraction firm called Braille and Son. Nobody at Braille and Son was particularly careful about anything. The work itself was careful. It had to be, because the Ithran Chain was a geological mess of unstable shelf rock, active caldera systems, and thermal vent fields that could open under your feet with about 30 seconds warning if you weren't paying attention. But the paperwork, the organizational structure, the record keeping, none of that was careful. When I left after 4 years with a battered field notebook, 2 healed fractures, a detailed knowledge of seismic precursor signatures, and a reference letter from my supervisor that misspelled my name twice, I was not entirely sure what credentials I actually held. The Interspecies Survey Cooperative was thorough. They took my application, assessed my file, found the Braille and Son records, found the Ithran survey logs, found the 18 pages of handwritten terrain notes I had attached as supplementary material, and then put me through a battery of practical assessments. I passed all of them. What they could not determine, given the state of Braille and Son's record-keeping, was whether I had completed the formal deep terrain navigation certification module that was a prerequisite for the upper-tier field licenses. There was no record of completion. There was also no record of non-completion. There was just a gap where the record should have been. Standard procedure in that situation was a referral to an accredited navigation academy for the relevant module. The accredited academy the cooperative system assigned to my file was Veth-Kalavar. I don't think anyone at the cooperative looked very hard at the assignment before rubber stamping it. Veth Kalavar was accredited. The module existed. The paperwork matched. The fact that Veth Kalavar trained Velthric cadets using methodology and testing frameworks built entirely around magnetoreceptive biological hardware that humans did not possess. That detail did not appear in the field the system checked. So I arrived on the station platform of Veth Kalavar with a duffel bag and a battered copy of the assigned pre-reading materials, which I had read twice on the transport, and found both comprehensive and, in several places, cheerfully incompatible with human biology. Commander Asev Tural was the first ranking officer I saw. He was waiting at the platform intake desk himself, which I later understood was unusual. It was the first day of a new cohort, and he appeared to have come down personally to inspect the incoming class. He was tall for a Velthric, which meant his head came to about my sternum, and his carapace was the deep red-brown of old lacquered wood with a faint iridescent shimmer at the shoulder seams. His compound eyes were fixed on me from the moment the transport doors opened. I was the only human on the platform. This was obvious. I walked to the desk and handed over my enrollment documentation. He read it without touching it, using the second pair of finer jointed appendages at his midsection to hold the pages at an angle. He read it the way someone reads a document they have read before but are checking for errors they expect to find. He turned 2 pages back, compared something to something, turned them forward again. Marin Voss, he said. His galactic standard was precise and slightly formal, the way some species' speech sounds when they learn the language from textbooks rather than conversation. That's me. You are human. Yes. He set the papers down. He looked at me for a long moment, not rudely, but with the particular quality of attention that I would later understand was his default, the look of a being doing a calculation. You do not have knowing skin. No. The first threshold requires the full engagement of the navigation sense across an unmapped sector of 9 square kilometers. The trial duration is 6 hours. No cadet has completed the first threshold in less than 1 hour 47 minutes. He paused. That cadet held the record for 8 years. I read the module description, I said. You read it, he said. Not dismissive, exactly. Just noting the fact the way you note that a tool is the wrong size for a fastener. There was a specific quality to it that I recognized from my years on Ithran, where the more experienced hands sometimes looked at something a new hire had done and said exactly that. You read the manual before demonstrating why the manual had missed something important. I read it twice, actually. Another pause. You understand that the assessment methodology of this module was not designed for human sensory architecture. I understand that, Commander. He picked up the enrollment forms again, squared them against the desk surface, and placed them in the intake tray. Then you understand that my professional expectation is that you will not complete the first threshold. I understand that's your expectation, I said. He looked at me. There was something in his expression, if you could call it that, since Velthric facial musculature does not move the way mammalian facial musculature moves, but there is expression in the angle of the mandible, the position of the secondary eye membranes, the set of the shoulder seams. That was not quite contempt. It was more precise than contempt. It was the expression of a being who has assigned something to a category and considers the assignment closed. Bavel, he said. I picked up my duffel bag, looking forward to it, Commander. That was the beginning. The cohort was 22 cadets, including me. 21 Velthric, ranging from 18 to 26 years old by their species reckoning, and 1 human. The Velthric cadets were a mix, some from established academy families, a few from frontier survey clans, one a cadet named Rethosavan, who had tested into the academy from a working navigation team, and was older than the others by 3 years, quieter, and considerably more technically skilled. Rethosavon's carapace had the slightly worn quality of someone who had spent significant time in actual field environments, the edges of the shoulder plates beveled by real, weather rather than the polished appearance of cadets who had spent their lives in training facilities. They were not unkind to me. This is worth saying plainly, because I have told this story to people who assume there must have been hostility, some organized resistance to my presence. There was not. What there was instead was a kind of steady, collective certainty. The certainty of a group that knows how a thing works and has simply observed that one member of the group does not have the equipment the thing requires. It was not cruelty. It was an assessment, shared and unspoken, that I was going to struggle, and that this was not a reflection on me personally but on the facts of my biology. Cadets spoke to me at meals, asked the ordinary questions. Where was I from? What had I done before the academy? Why navigation certification? I answered. They listened. Some of them were curious. The concept of a human doing deep terrain survey work apparently struck several of them as unusual. One of the younger cadets, a female named Vithoron who sat beside me in the morning lectures, asked me once what it was like to navigate without knowing skin. She was not asking to be rude. She seemed genuinely puzzled, the way someone is puzzled by a concept that has never occurred to them before as a genuine option. It's like navigating with knowing skin, I said, except that everything I know has to come from what I can see. She considered this. But what you can see, that is so much less than what you can feel. It depends on how carefully you look, I said. She tilted her head, the Velthric nod, and went back to her notes, and I could see from the quality of her attention that she was not convinced, not in the least, but was too polite to press it further. The first week was classroom work and orientation exercises. I paid close attention. I took notes the way I had always taken notes on Ithran, shorthand notation in the margins, sketches of the diagrams the instructor drew on the hollow table, annotations connecting one concept to the prior day's material. The other cadets processed the lectures through their knowing skin as much as through their minds. I could see it in the way they would go very still during a demonstration, the plates of their carapaces angling slightly, picking up the simulated field data the instructors were broadcasting through the training room's emitters. For them, the theory was confirmation of something they could already feel. For me, the theory was all there was, and I held on to it carefully. I built maps. This was not something the curriculum told me to do. It was something I had done since my second month on Ithran when I was 22 years old and my supervisor, a laconic man named Brawl who had been doing island survey work for 30 years, handed me a blank journal and told me to stop relying on the official charts. The official charts are right about the big things, he said. The big things will not kill you. The small things will kill you. Map the small things. So I had mapped the small things. For 4 years. Every caldera shoulder, every fault seam, every subsidence hollow and drainage pattern and wind shadow zone and tidal exposure gradient along every shoreline I had worked. I had learned to read terrain the way the terrain wanted to be read, not the way the charts said it should look. Drainage patterns told you where the rock was soft. Vegetation told you where the water ran slow versus fast. Pressure differentials in valley networks told you, if you knew how to listen, whether a collapse zone was active or dormant. The behavior of loose surface material told you the recent wind history. The color banding in exposed rock faces told you the erosion rate, and therefore the rough age of the surface exposure. None of this required magnetoreceptive tissue. All of it required years of walking difficult ground and paying attention to what the ground was telling you. At Veth Kalavar, I did not have years. I had 3 weeks before the first threshold. I used them. The academy had a terrain simulation room that cadets could book for independent practice. The booking system showed me that, in the past 6 cohorts, cadets had used the simulation room on average 8 times before the first threshold. The record was 12, held by a cadet who had graduated 2 cycles earlier and was now working deep terrain survey on a high-risk geological contract that paid accordingly. The simulation room bookings were tracked by the administration. I know because I looked them up. I booked it 14 times in 3 weeks, for the maximum permitted session length each time. I was there when the room opened in the morning, and I was often the last one out when it closed in the evening. The duty technician who managed the simulation room was a Velthric named Osveron, a quiet and efficient older being who accepted my booking requests without comment for the first week, and on the second week, after I came in for my 9th session on consecutive days, looked at me with his secondary eye membranes fully extended and said, "You are here again." "I am," I said. "You were here yesterday." "Yes." "And the day before." "That's right." He looked at my booking schedule. He looked at me. "You know that the simulation room cannot replicate knowing skin field contact. The emitters broadcast the standard magnetic field data, but if you do not have knowing skin, you are not receiving it." "I know," I said. "Then what," he said, with what seemed like genuine curiosity, "are you doing in there for 4 hours at a time?" "Walking," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached past me and opened the simulation room door. "Go walk," he said. I was not practicing the navigation drills the way the other cadets practiced them, tuning their knowing skin to simulated field environments, learning to distinguish one magnetic signature from another, developing the fine precision that the coursework rewarded. That path was closed to me, and I had known it was closed from the first day I read the module description on the transport. What I was doing was different. I was loading the simulation environments and walking them. Every environment the sim room could generate, I walked. I was building a vocabulary. Every planet type has a terrain vocabulary. The way volcanic substrate crumbles under load is different from the way sedimentary substrate crumbles. The way a ridgeline drains in a high-humidity environment is different from the way it drains in an arid one. The way an unstable slope signals its instability, in the give of the surface, in the sound of your own footfall, in the behavior of the runoff gullies, this is a language. It is not an easy language and it is not a fast one to learn, but it is a language, and I had been learning it for 4 years on Ithran. What the simulation room gave me was new vocabularies, new planet types, new substrate compositions, some of which had no equivalent in the Ithran volcanic chain, and required me to invent new notation systems to capture them, new environmental pressure profiles, new vegetation types, new drainage patterns, new wind behavior signatures in valley geometries that I had never encountered. I walked them and I listened, and I wrote down what I learned. My 3rd field notebook of the posting was half full by the 2nd week. I also memorized the first threshold sector map. The map existed. It was in the Academy library, under the same access permissions as all the other trial resources, which were available to all cadets. The library records showed that most cadets accessed it once, briefly, early in their first week, a cursory review, the way you might glance at the cover of a book you know you will read later. Then they closed it and relied on their knowing skin. Most cadets did not look at it very closely, because the map was a Velthric format survey document. It showed magnetic anomaly distributions, seismic resonance zones, atmospheric pressure gradients layered in 3-dimensional cross-section. For a being with knowing skin, this map was a rich data set, a preview of what the terrain would feel like when they walked it, the way a musician might read sheet music and hear the sound in their head before they ever touched the instrument. For a being without knowing skin, it looked like noise. Colored contours and numerical annotations that pointed to information the reader could not access. I could not feel magnetic anomalies, but I could read topographic inference. Magnetic anomaly patterns, when you know what you are looking at, correlate with subsurface geology, ore deposits, void spaces, saturation boundaries, fault zones. A strong magnetic high under a ridge means dense ferrous rock, which means the ridge holds and the drainage runs clean. A magnetic low in a valley bottom might mean a void space or a soft fill zone, which means the valley bottom may not behave the way the surface suggests. The seismic resonance maps correlated with terrain stability. Zones of high resonance were zones of active stress, zones to treat with care. The atmospheric pressure gradients, read the right way, told you about elevation changes and the prevailing flow directions in the valley networks. I could not read the map the way a Velthric could read it, but I could triangulate. I could build a secondary representation, a kind of translation layer from their sensory language to mine. It was slower. It was less precise. It required making assumptions and inferences that a knowing-skinned navigator would never need to make, because they could simply feel the answer rather than derive it. But it worked, and it produced a map I could use. I spent 6 nights on the Threshold sector map. I went through 6 iterations of my translation, each one refining the previous. By the 4th iteration, I could look at any section of the sector and name the probable terrain features it would express on the surface. By the 6th iteration, I had 3 route options plotted through the 9-kilometer sector, with probability assessments for each and contingency branches where the inference was uncertain. I showed none of this to anyone, not because I was hiding it exactly, but because it did not occur to me that it was worth showing. It was just preparation. It was what you did before you walked on ground you didn't know. The night before the first threshold, the cohort gathered in the common bay for the standard pre-trial briefing. Commander Asif Tural ran it himself. He went through the rules: no external equipment, no communication devices, no assistance of any kind, and then went through the grading criteria, and then explained with the same precise flatness he used for all instructional content, that the trial was designed to assess navigation competence under conditions of environmental uncertainty, that failure to reach the exit marker within the 6-hour window constituted a failed attempt, and that failed attempts were retakeable at 30-day intervals. He went through the cohort alphabetically, assigning start window slots. Most cadets were clustered in the middle slots. I was assigned to the 3rd slot, which meant I would enter the trial sector 90 minutes after the first cadet, while several cohort members were still on course. When he finished the roster, he looked around the room. The cadets were still, the pre-trial quiet that I had come to recognize as their equivalent of tension, the plates of their carapaces sitting just slightly more flush than usual, the posture of a group preparing to perform. "This trial has a history," he said. "The history is not a comfortable one for any cohort. It is designed not to be comfortable. The terrain is unmapped in the sense that your knowing skin will encounter signatures it has not cataloged. You are not being tested on familiarity. You are being tested on the capacity to read the unfamiliar in real time." He paused. "The cohort record is 1 hour 47 minutes. I do not expect it to be broken this cycle." His compound eyes moved across the room and settled on me for a fraction of a second, a precise, almost clinical fraction of a second. "Some of you face greater challenges than others. This is also by design. The terrain does not adjust to the navigator. The navigator adjusts to the terrain." No one looked at me. That was the quality of the moment. Nobody turned. Nobody made it obvious. But I felt the not looking with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 4 years being the only human in a field crew of non-human surveyors. The room's attention was distributed. The not looking at me was its own kind of looking. I ate my chalk and copper ration block and went to bed. I slept well. I almost always sleep well the night before field work. The trial sector was accessed through a groundside portal on the station's lower deck, leading to a pressurized entry lock, and then a short transit car that carried you to the surface installation. I entered my start window slot with the specific quiet alertness of a field morning, the awareness that sits behind the eyes and doesn't talk much, just watches. The same feeling I had learned to recognize on Ithran as useful. the feeling that meant your attention had shifted to the right gear. The entry lock opened onto a ridge. The planet the Academy was stationed on was called Veth Kalavar itself. The institution had taken its name from the world, which the Velthric had been surveying for 3 generations. The surface was cool and dry, the atmosphere within tolerance for humans without supplemental equipment, the gravity at approximately 92% of standard. The terrain was what I would have classified, on Ithran, as mature volcanic, not geologically young but not senescent either, a mix of basalt shelf, wind-eroded scarp, and deep thermal fracture networks running in rough parallel lines toward the lowland basin to the southwest. The light was a yellowish gray, filtered through a thin high cloud layer, and it sat on the rocks the way afternoon light sits on pale stone flat, even without strong shadow direction. The kind of light that makes terrain harder to read. I had memorized the sector map. I recognized the ridge. Not by the magnetism, not by any seismic sense. By the silhouette, the way it broke against the sky, the angle of the eastern scarp face, the width of the saddle to the northwest. I had looked at this ridge for 6 nights on the map, and I knew it the way you know a face you have studied. I set a bearing southwest-southwest, noted the angle of the cloud-diffused light for dead reckoning reference, checked the wind direction against the predicted atmospheric flow for this sector, and started walking. The tailless field was where I had expected it. Below the ridge on the descent side, loose basalt rubble in the characteristic angular scatter of a geologically recent break, recent meaning within the last few thousand years, which in geological terms is essentially yesterday. The rock was dark gray-brown, the broken edges sharp enough to cut, the pile steep enough to make your ankles work for every step. I moved carefully, planting each foot flat, reading the shift of the rocks underfoot before committing weight. Talus is a negotiation. You do not force it. At the base of the talus, the compression valley opened up. Narrow, maybe 30 meters across at its widest, the walls of the valley rising in smooth, water-smoothed basalt on both sides. The streambed was dry. The survey documents had noted a seasonal drought cycle, but the drainage gravel was clean and gray and sorted by water, which meant it was the real bed and the water ran this way regularly. I found the gravel's grain size, which was medium to coarse, which told me the gradient was moderate to steep in this section. Water runs to the basin. Follow the drainage. I turned downstream and kept moving. This is the thing about terrain navigation that people who have not done it sometimes misunderstand. They think it is about tools. They think it is about the equipment you carry, the sensors you bring, the technology that reads the environment and gives you the answer. Tools help. Tools are good. I was not dismissing the knowing skin. It was a remarkable biological instrument, and watching the Velthric cadets use it in the simulation drills had been genuinely impressive. Their precision was something I could not match and did not expect to match. But terrain navigation at its core is about reading a story. The land is always telling you where things are and where they go. The water tells you the low points. The vegetation tells you the moisture, where the ground holds water and where it runs dry, which tells you the rock type and the depth to substrate. The rock tells you the pressure history and the fracture networks. A caldera tells you where the heat comes from and which direction the prevailing thermal gradient flows. A shadow tells you the time and the direction in good light. In bad light, the vegetation's directional lean does the same work. Everything is evidence. Everything is readable. The question is whether you have trained yourself to read the evidence or whether you are waiting for a machine, any kind of machine, biological or otherwise, to read it for you. I had spent 4 years on Ithran learning to read it myself, because Brawl had refused to do it for me. He had been a patient teacher in everything except one thing, and that one thing was this. He would not tell me what he could see until I had told him what I could see. "You first," he said, every morning at every new site, with the same mild voice and the same complete absence of drama. "What do you read?" And I had learned to read, or I had failed to navigate the next 8 hours of field work on a geologically unstable volcanic island chain, and failure to navigate had consequences that I found clarifying. The drainage valley ran for just under 2 kilometers. I followed it steadily, reading as I went. I marked 2 things along the way. A subsidence depression to my left that the drainage gravel's distribution told me was a slow-developing void beneath the surface, something to give a wide berth to on return trips, and a wind-scoured exposure of banded rock in the valley wall that confirmed I was tracking the predicted transition from primary basalt to the composite substrate of the basin margin. The banding was exactly where the inference from the magnetic anomaly map had suggested it would appear. That kind of confirmation is its own quiet pleasure. It is not the pleasure of surprise. It is the pleasure of having done the reading correctly. I crossed 2 subsidiary ridges, both where I had expected them from the fracture network patterns, both navigable at the saddle points the map's topology had implied. The second ridge was steeper than I had anticipated from the inference data, and I took an extra 12 minutes finding the best line over it. This was acceptable. I had contingency time built into my estimate. On the far side of the second ridge, the basin opened. It was a broad, shallow depression, maybe 4 kilometers across at its widest point, the floor covered in the pale, dry vegetation that grew on the interior plains of this planet, low, stiff-stemmed, the color of old paper. I could see the thermal vent cluster from the ridge edge, 3 kilometers distant. The vegetation around it was distinctly different in color and growth pattern, and above the cluster itself, barely visible in the flat light, a shimmer of hot air. The heat rising from the vents created a visible refraction in the atmosphere above them, a barely perceptible wavering that you had to know to look for. I knew to look for it. I had seen it in the simulation room's highest fidelity thermal environments, practiced reading it there, until I could locate it at greater and greater distances. I set a direct line for the vent cluster and crossed the basin floor in 22 minutes. The vegetation shifted under my boots as the ground temperature changed, the stiff-stemmed pale plants giving way gradually to the leathery reddish-gray low growers that occupied the thermal zone, their growth pattern tightening as the soil temperature increased. I read the contour of the transition the way you read a contour line on a map. It was telling me exactly where the gradient ran, and therefore exactly where the vent cluster's center was, even before I could see the sulfur staining on the rocks. The sulfur staining appeared at about 400 meters, a pale yellow wash on the gray basalt, faint enough that you would miss it without knowing to look, but unmistakable once you had looked once. The clay-crusted soil that the survey documents had described began at about 250 meters, the surface texture changing from the firm, dry mineral soil of the basin floor to a slightly crusted, slightly yielding surface that required more care underfoot. Not dangerous if you read it, dangerous if you didn't. I found the exit marker at 14 meters from the nearest active vent. It was a small device, a sealed transponder in a housing no larger than my fist, secured in a cradle of piled flat stones with the practiced neatness of someone who had placed many such markers in many such locations. I picked it up and keyed the completion signal. The transponder's indicator light went from amber to green, and a soft chime sounded, barely audible over the low hiss of the vent behind me. I set it back in its cradle, straightened up, and looked at the time display on my wrist. 41 minutes, 17 seconds. I stood there for a moment in the thermal wash from the vent cluster, with the sulfur smell and the reddish-gray vegetation and the pale yellow stones around me, and I felt the familiar combination of things that I always felt at the end of a good piece of field work, a quiet satisfaction, a mild physical tiredness, and a slight anticlimax. The ground had said what it was going to say. I had listened. I had found the thing. I thought about Brawl, who had retired to a small house on the Osmeran mainland, and who I had not spoken to in 2 years, and I thought about what he would have said if I had tried to explain this moment to him. He would have said, "So, you found the thing." And I would have said yes. And he would have said, "Good, write it down." I activated the return transit and walked back to the entry installation. The station's interior lights had the slightly blue-shifted quality of early afternoon when I came through the entry lock. The duty officer at the log desk was a young Velthric cadet, not from my cohort, one of the upper-year students doing administrative rotation. And she looked up when I came in and then looked at the wall clock, and then looked back at me with the particular frozen quality of someone whose brain has just received information it cannot categorize. "First threshold," I said, and held up my wrist for her to scan the return confirmation. She scanned it. She looked at the readout. She looked at the clock again. Her secondary eye membranes, I noticed, were fully extended, the Velthric equivalent of wide eyes. She was young enough that she had not yet developed the professional composure to conceal it. "The trial window for your entry slot," she began. "Has 5 hours and 19 minutes remaining," I said. "I know." She recorded the completion. She did not say anything else, but she also did not look away from me until I had reached the elevator bank. I took the elevator to the cadet's residence level, removed my field boots, and lay down on my bunk. I was mildly thirsty. My feet ached in the way they always ache after tailless descent and extended basin crossing, a deep, bone-level tiredness that is not painful exactly but is very present. The sulfur smell was still faintly in my hair. Outside the small porthole above my bunk, the station's running lights were just starting to compete with the yellowing afternoon sky. I slept for 2 hours. When I came back to the common bay that evening, the rest of the cohort was in various stages of return. They came back in ones and twos over the course of an hour, and I watched them come in from my seat near the dispenser, the particular quality of each arrival telling its own story. Some came in with the easy posture of cadets who had done well and knew it, a slight carry in the shoulders, a directness in the way they moved through the room. Others came in tightly, the plates of their carapaces held close in the Velthric posture of contained frustration. Rethosivan came in second overall, at 2 hours 12 minutes, which was a strong time, and which he received with the quiet satisfaction of someone for whom strong times were expected. Several others clustered between 2 hours 40 and 3 hours 20, which the module documentation described as a typical first attempt distribution. The 2 youngest cadets had not yet returned when I came in. They had been pulled at the 5-hour mark by the trial monitoring system, which had flagged them as off course, and were being debriefed separately. This happened in most cohort cycles, apparently. The first threshold was designed to claim some percentage of a first attempt cohort. It was built into the expectations. When the time logs went up on the common bay display screen, standard academy procedure, results posted promptly. There was a stillness in the room that was different from ordinary Velthric stillness. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then several cadets turned to look at me, and the quality of those looks was a variety of things. Calculation, reassessment, something that in at least one cadet I read as a mild form of shock. 41 minutes 17 seconds, first completion, first overall. I got a ration block from the dispenser and sat down at my usual table. Rethosivan came and sat across from me. He was quiet for a moment, the way the Velthric are quiet when they are arranging something, not awkward silence, the deliberate kind, the kind that is itself a form of respect. Then he said, 41 minutes. Yes. How? Not how did you do it, not I don't understand, just how. The direct question of a navigator who had worked real field assignments and knew that performance had reasons and wanted to understand the reasons. So I told him, the map translation work, the simulation room sessions, the terrain vocabulary I had built on Ithran and extended in the sim room, world type by world type, the drainage logic that had carried me down from the ridge, the banding in the valley wall that confirmed the substrate transition, The way the vegetation growth pattern in the thermal zone had given me a visible gradient to follow when the exit marker itself was still too distant to identify. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet again for a moment. His secondary eye membranes shifted slowly. "You translated the survey map," he said. "As much as I could." "You walked the simulation room." 14 sessions. "I walked it 6 times, he said. "I thought that was thorough." He was not defensive about this. He said it the way a good navigator reports data, accurately without editorializing. "You used more sessions than anyone in the cohort." "I needed them more than anyone in the cohort." He tilted his head, the Velthric nod. "You used different rooms than the rest of us. I noticed the booking logs. You ran terrain types that are not in the standard pre-threshold preparation list." The standard preparation list was built for cadets with knowing skin. I needed different terrain vocabulary. "Different vocabulary," he repeated. He turned that phrase over carefully, the way someone turns an object to look at all its faces. "You navigated by vocabulary, by reading." "By reading," I said, "yes." He put both sets of hands flat on the table, the gesture of formal acknowledgement, not casual, deliberate. "I wanted to tell you that I understand what you did," he said. "Not everyone in this cohort does yet, but I have worked navigation teams and I know what it looks like when someone reads terrain and when someone uses instruments to read terrain for them. What you did in there was terrain reading." He paused. "It was also faster than anything I have seen in a first cohort." "I had done most of the reading before I entered the sector," I said. "That is also navigation," he said simply. I ate my ration block. Commander Asif Turol called me to his office the following morning. He was standing when I came in, not seated. In Velthric professional protocol, this indicated a formal interaction. The standing posture was the framing of a significant exchange, the equivalent of a formal salutation. I stood as well. The office was spare. A desk surface, 2 low-slung chairs that were designed for Velthric hip geometry and were slightly awkward for human anatomy, and a wide viewport looking out over the planet's surface. The vent cluster was visible in the distance, a faint shimmer above the basin floor. "Your first threshold time has been logged," he said. 41 minutes, 17 seconds. This is the new cohort record. He paused. "It is also the new Academy record by 8 minutes and 42 seconds. "I see." "The previous Academy record," he said, "was held by a cadet who graduated 14 years ago and is currently the lead navigator for a deep terrain survey operation on a Class 3 geological hazard world." He said this with the precision of someone who had looked up the record before this meeting. "She is, by all reports, one of the finest terrain navigators working today." "That's a high benchmark," I said. "It is," he paused. "I would like to understand your methodology." So I told him what I had told Reth Asivan, but in more detail, because Asif Turol asked more precise questions. He wanted to understand the map translation in specific terms, how I had derived surface topology from magnetic anomaly distributions, which inference steps I had considered reliable and which I had flagged as uncertain. He wanted to understand the simulation room practice, not the schedule, which he had presumably already seen in the booking logs, but the content, what I had been doing in those sessions and what I had learned. He wanted to understand the role of the terrain vocabulary I had described, how it had been built, how long it had taken, what its practical limits were. I answered each question as precisely as I could. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You did not use knowing skin," he said. "No." "You could not use knowing skin." "No." "You used inference." "Yes." He moved to the viewport. The surface lay below us, the basin floor pale and still in the morning light, the vent cluster visible at its far edge. He stood there for a moment with his back to me, looking at the terrain where I had walked the day before. "The Academy curriculum," he he said slowly, with the precision of someone thinking out loud in a second language, was written by beings with knowing skin, for beings with knowing skin. The underlying assumption, an assumption so fundamental that it is not stated, because it never needed to be stated, because it was never in question, is that direct sensory contact with the terrain environment is the basis of navigation competence. He paused. The shoulder seams of his carapace shifted slightly. What you demonstrated is that inference from secondary evidence produces equivalent competence in your case, given sufficient preparation, more than equivalent. In my case, I said, with this type of terrain. Yes, he turned from the viewport, and with a level of preparation that no cadet has brought to this trial before. I needed more preparation than the other cadets, so I did more preparation. He looked at me for a long time. The compound eyes and the expression I had come to read in the angle of his mandible, and the position of his secondary membranes were doing something I had not seen them do before, something that did not map cleanly to any of the expressions I had catalogued over 3 weeks of observation. "Bavel," he said. "You can stop calling me that," I said. "Yes," he said, "I think I can." He dismissed me after that, and I walked back to the residence level, and that was, more or less, the end of the matter in one practical sense. In another sense, it was not the end of anything. There were 14 more weeks of coursework and 4 more threshold trials, each successively harder than the last, and I passed every one of them. The second threshold was the most difficult. It involved a night crossing of a complex canyon system, and the inference work from the survey map was genuinely uncertain in 3 sections where the magnetic anomaly data was ambiguous. I took the conservative routes in those sections, which cost me time, and finished in 2 hours 19 minutes rather than the sub-2 hours I had estimated. Still first overall. The third threshold was a water feature navigation problem on a rain-flooded basin plain, and water navigation was something I had practiced extensively on Ithran, so that one was less difficult than the topography would have suggested to someone who didn't know my background. The fourth and fifth were technical assessments in environments that required extended knowing skin calibration, and those I passed by the margins rather than the margins I had built in the earlier trials. The certification examination had a section on knowing skin microcalibration that required 3 additional consultation sessions with the module coordinator, who was a Velthric named Reth Vasan, who had clearly never thought about how to teach the relevant concepts to someone without the relevant biology. We figured it out together. She was patient and creative. I was persistent. The workaround we developed, a set of inference techniques that replicated the microcalibration outputs using visual and tactile surface data, was not in the curriculum. After the examination, she filed a notation about it with the module documentation committee. None of that is the point of this story. The point of this story is what happened in the months after. The certification I received from Veth Kalavar was a standard deep terrain navigation certification, same as the one every graduating cadet received. It listed my name and my cohort year, and the trial records I had set, and the module competencies I had demonstrated. It did not say anything about knowing skin, or about inference, or about the fact that I had navigated 9 square kilometers of unmapped volcanic terrain using dead reckoning, map translation, drainage logic, and a methodology developed for a completely different sensory architecture. When I filed it with the Interspecies Survey Cooperative, I got a form acknowledgement and a processing reference number. Bureaucratic routine. The paperwork gap in my record was closed. 3 months later, I received a transmission from the Veth Karan Joint Navigation Training Center, a multi-species facility on a station orbiting the world adjacent to Veth Kalavar, operated by a consortium of 6 species with varying navigation sensory architectures. The transmission was from the center's curriculum committee. They had received a report from Veth Kalavar. They wanted to know if I would be willing to consult on the development of a navigation training module for cadets who lacked standard magnetoreceptive architecture. I read the transmission twice. I thought about whether I was the right person for this, because I had done a thing successfully once, and that did not obviously qualify me to teach the methodology to others, and I said as much to the committee in my response. They replied that the thing I had done had not been done before, and that what they were asking me to help design was not a curriculum but a framework, a starting point, not a finished edifice. I wrote back and said yes. The module I helped design over the following 6 months was not a replacement for the standard Velthric methodology. It was what Asev Tural had named it in his office that morning, a system of inference from secondary evidence, developed for sensory architectures that navigate by reading rather than by feeling. Drainage logic. Substrate behavior. Atmospheric pressure gradient inference from vegetation patterns. Terrain vocabulary built by walked experience and accumulated observation. The translation layer I had built for the Velthric survey maps, adapted into a teachable format. We called it the Secondary Evidence Navigation Protocol in the first internal drafts. The curriculum committee wanted a more formal name, something with more technical weight, and I spent 2 weeks arguing with them about it before they won. The official documentation calls it the Vassenford Navigation Framework. I find this embarrassing. Brawl would have found it funnier than I do. He was not a man who thought much of things being named after the people who did them. He thought things should be named after what they were, and what this was, he would have said, was reading. Just reading. The protocol is now a standard module at 7 affiliated institutions, used by cadets from 12 species with varying sensory architectures. It is taught alongside the standard magnetoreceptive curriculum, not as a replacement but as a parallel path. There is a note in the module introduction about its origins, a human cadet who completed the Veth Kalavar first threshold in 41 minutes, and I have been told that cadets from non-Velthric species sometimes find this note encouraging. I understand this. I am not sure I am comfortable with it exactly, but I understand it. Rethosavan and I have stayed in contact. He completed the academy that same year and went on to work deep survey on a pair of geologically active worlds in a system with a name I can never pronounce correctly. And when I was putting together the practical exercise library for the secondary evidence protocol, I consulted him extensively on how the Velthric sensory experience of navigation compares to my inferential experience. His perspective was, as it had always been, precise and direct. He told me once that the most interesting thing he had learned from watching me navigate was not the methodology itself, but the degree of commitment it required. Knowing skin is continuous, he said. It updates in real time. You feel when you are wrong and you correct immediately. Your method commits to an interpretation and holds it. That is a different discipline. I had not thought of it as a discipline, exactly. I had thought of it as the only option available. Sometimes, Rethosavan said, those are the same thing. I suppose he was right. On Ithran, you committed to your reading of the terrain or you did not go out. There was no middle position, no hedging, no waiting for additional confirmation. The ground was going to tell you what it was going to tell you, and you were going to listen, and then you were going to walk on it, and either you were right about what you had heard or you were not. The caldera either held or it did not. The shelf rock either sustained your weight or it collapsed. The vent field either announced itself in the precursor signatures you had learned to read, or you found it the hard way. You learned to read, you read, you walked. Commander Asev Tural's final assessment report on my cohort performance, which I received from the cooperative as part of my certification file, and which I read once, in a transit lounge on the way to the first consultancy meeting about the new protocol, included a section on my trial records and module performance, and at the end of that section, one sentence. He wrote, The information available to a navigator is not determined by the navigator's sensory architecture, but by the quality of the navigator's attention. I read that sentence in the transit lounge with a bad cup of the coffee-adjacent drink that transit stations serve, and I thought, yes, that's about right. I took out my field notebook, I wrote it down,